Welcome to the Linden Hills History Study Group's virtual program. Tonight's program will be presented by Linda Lounsbury on the fight for women's suffrage from a Minneapolis perspective. My name is Joellen Haugo, and I'm the co-chair of the Linden Hills History Study Group. The passage of the 19th Amendment was ratified in August 100 years ago this week. It allowed all women of the United States the right to vote in elections. During the push to grant women the right to vote, Gracia Countryman was hired to head the Minneapolis Public Library. As our speaker tonight will mention, Gracia received 1/3 the pay that her predecessor, a man, received. When I hear today about the pay discrepancies that women, especially women of color, experience compared to men, I am dismayed. It took women a good 60 years of hard work to get the right to vote. Understanding this helps me comprehend how significant obstacles can be to institute change. In 2020, there have been numerous programs and exhibits on the milestone of the passage of the 19th Amendment. We are very pleased to contribute to this celebration with a focus on Minnesota and specifically Minneapolis. It is my honor to introduce Linda Lunsbury. Linda has been active in the Linden Hills History Study Group for many years, including presenting the 2017 program, Power to the People, Activism in the 1970s. Her passion for history is evident in her activities, which include volunteering at the Hennepin History Museum. A few years ago, Linda wrote her doctoral thesis on women's suffrage in Minnesota. We are so fortunate to have her to share her research with us today. Welcome, Linda.
August 26, 2020, marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which gave women the right to vote. Or rather, women finally won the right to equal franchise by the persistent efforts of men and women over a period of 72 years. As we remember those who made it possible, you may find some of the story familiar. Not everyone does, so bear with me as I summarize the background. For many years, I have made historical doll costumes as birthday gifts for my nieces and great-nieces. When one of my great-nieces received this trio of costumes for Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she was shocked to read in the included biography that no woman could attend college until Oberlin began accepting female students in 1837. You might say it all started in 1776. While John Adams was off in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, Abigail Adams wrote to him, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies." John's response? "I cannot but laugh," he wrote. All men might be created equal, but women were not equal to men. The reason for Abigail's concern is obvious when we look at the code of laws relating to the legal position of women under English common law, as codified by William Blackstone. Married women were characterized legally as femme couverte, a covered woman. That is, they had no legal existence because the law said that the husband and wife were one flesh and the husband was the one. That meant that upon marriage a woman ceased to exist legally. The wife's property, whether by inheritance or earnings, was legally her husband's to do with as he chose. Ideally, the husband would use the property wisely for the benefit of the family, but no law prevented the husband from spending it on alcohol, other women, gambling, or unwise business ventures. In cases of death or divorce, the husband had the sole right to choose a guardian for his children, even against the wishes of their mother. Wills of the time typically left major assets, such as land, to sons and less valuable items such as furniture or livestock to daughters. Married women, owning nothing, could not make a will or sue in a court of law or sign contracts. An unmarried woman, a femme sole, was free of these restrictions, but had few opportunities to be self-supporting. A few lucky single women or widows inherited wealth, most did not. A daughter could live as a dependent with her father or brothers, or a widow with her surviving children. Otherwise, a life of hard work and poverty was the price of independence. Domestic service was the job most readily available to a single woman, but it paid little beyond room and board. Women in factories and farms were paid half of what men made. Women earned a pittance as teachers or governesses, but could never be college professors. Women were not accepted into colleges or apprenticeships, so they could not train for well-paid careers in religion, medicine, or law. Nursing was done at home and was poorly paid, if paid at all. Secretaries were all male. A widow who had a little capital might run a small business, such as a boarding house or dress shop. Ironically, a few women could vote because owning property over a certain value was the sole requirement in some places. In post-revolution New Jersey, the law defined voters as inhabitants who owned property worth more than 50 pounds, equivalent in purchasing power to about $8,200 in 2020. A few well-to-do widows or unmarried heiresses would therefore be eligible to vote. Voter lists show anywhere from 7 to 14% of the voters were female. However, an amendment in 1806 changed the wording to male inhabitants. Although politically powerless, women took an interest in the big questions of the day, and the biggest of these was slavery. Women in the abolitionist movement held fundraising fairs, circulated petitions, organized boycotts of slave-grown cotton and sugar, and helped run the Underground Railroad. Sarah and Angelina Grimke, two sisters from a slave-owning family in South Carolina, moved north in 1828 and began speaking and writing about the horrors of the slave system. At first, they held private meetings with other women, but when they addressed mixed groups, they were scolded from the pulpit and ridiculed by the press. St. Paul had said women were not to instruct men, and besides, it was immodest for a woman to speak in public. In Philadelphia, a mob broke windows and set fire to the building where they were speaking. As women began to challenge the traditional definitions of woman's sphere by writing or speaking for controversial causes, a few began to enter non-traditional occupations. In 1840, the World Abolition Convention was held in London. Delegates from American abolition groups attended, and among them were 8 women. The English gentlemen and many of the Americans were scandalized that the American women expected to speak and vote in the convention. After a day of debate on the subject, the male delegates voted that the female delegates be barred from the floor. The women were seated in the visitors' gallery where they could listen but not participate. One of them was Lucretia Mott, a Quaker matron who was used to women speaking to mixed assemblies. Seated there, she became acquainted with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a newlywed in London on her honeymoon with her abolitionist husband, Henry Stanton, who was a delegate. The two women shared their sense of outrage and spoke of holding a women's rights convention when they got back home. Life, including Stanton's first 3 children, interfered with this resolution until one summer in 1848. The family had moved to Seneca Falls in the Finger Lakes district of New York. Mott was visiting her sister in Auburn near Seneca Falls. When the two women met again at a tea party in Waterloo, New York, they talked about the subject of women's rights, what would later be called consciousness raising. They resolved to hold their convention that month. They drew up a declaration of sentiments based on the Declaration of Independence, stating their grievances and goals. The first of these was that men, quote, never permitted her to exercise her inalienable right to the elective franchise, unquote. Even Lucretia Mott thought this might be going too far, fearing a demand for voting rights would make their other resolutions look ridiculous. Although there had not been much time to publicize the event, a crowd of people turned up at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls for the 2 days of the convention on July 19th and 20th. Although their declaration advocated equal rights for women, the conveners did not feel equal to chairing the meeting and finally persuaded Lucretia's husband James Mott to call the meeting to order. After several speeches on the first day, resolutions were proposed and debated on the second day. Number 9, that women should secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise, gave the attendees pause. Frederick Douglass spoke in favor of it, and the resolution finally passed. 100 men and women signed the declaration, including a young woman named Charlotte Woodward, who lived to see the 19th Amendment ratified. News of the Women's Rights Convention appeared in newspapers, usually accompanied by ridicule. Imagine, a woman in the Senate or in the Army? Men would have to cook dinner and take care of babies. However, the publicity inspired women in other cities to hold women's rights conventions. Rochester, New York, 2 weeks later, in August 1848, Ohio in 1850 and 1851, Worcester, Massachusetts in 1850, 1851, and 1852. Temperance was another big issue of the time. The first temperance organizations were started by men, with women playing a supporting role. At a time when the quality of drinking water was variable at best, beer, wine, rum, or whiskey were preferred. Daniel Okrent calculated that in 1830 each adult American drank, on average, the equivalent alcoholic content of nearly 3 liters of 80-proof liquor per week, or 10 shots of whiskey every day. Since a woman could not sue for divorce just because her husband spent her wages on liquor or beat her in a drunken rage, women were especially vulnerable to the effects of alcoholism. Susan B. Anthony was active in both abolitionist and temperance causes. When she attended the state convention of the Sons of Temperance and tried to speak to a motion, the chairman declared, "Sisters were not invited here to speak, but to listen and to learn." After meeting Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, Anthony began to focus more and more of her energies on women's rights. The first generation of feminists worked for a broad range of reforms under the umbrella of women's rights. Public lectures and conventions spread the word, and not only to the already converted. When television, movies, and Netflix were unavailable, public lectures were a popular diversion. Many came only to heckle, but some went away with a different viewpoint. Lucy Stone, who started her career as a paid organizer for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society in 1847, was noted for her voice. Like a silver bell, said one listener. She had the ability to turn hecklers into protectors after being hit on the head with a thrown vegetable. She spoke for women's rights as well as against slavery in her talks. The Anti-Slavery Association finally insisted that she drop the women's issues while representing them. She agreed to speak about slavery on weekdays and about women's issues only on weekends on her own time. Suffrage was one of many reforms sought as a means to other ends. Progressive newspapers such as Frederick Douglass's North Star and Amelia Bloomer's Lily willingly printed articles by Stanton and others. Dress reform ideas led to the much ridiculed Bloomer costume. Stanton and Anthony and others adopted it early, but it soon became an attractive nuisance. The clothes distracted the audience from their arguments, so they returned to wearing long skirts. Laws changed in some states to protect married women's property rights. A few women were able to earn college degrees in medicine. Florence Nightingale in England began the slow process of establishing nursing as a respectable profession. The first recorded women's rights speech in Minnesota took place in Champlin in 1858, when Mary Jackman Colburn addressed the public on the rights and wrongs of woman. In 1857, Minnesota had missed its chance to be an equal suffrage leader when it became a state. A proposition was introduced in the Democratic wing of the Constitutional Convention to extend the franchise to married women, but the motion was ignored as too frivolous for notice, according to Falwell's History of Minnesota. Up until the Civil War, feminists were not organized into clubs. Individuals came together for conventions or lectures, but there was no formal structure. With the beginning of the Civil War, women dropped their agitation and threw themselves into war work. They became nurses, either on the front line like Clara Barton, or in Washington, D.C. like Dorothea Dix. At home, women raised funds to equip soldiers and hospitals. Some women became scouts like Harriet Tubman, and an estimated 400 to 700 women disguised themselves as men and served in the armed forces. With war over and slavery abolished, women thought their contributions to the war effort had proved that women deserved to vote. They formed the American Equal Rights Association in 1866, but the organization split in 1869 over differences in strategy. Stanton and Anthony formed the National Woman Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone and her husband Henry Blackwell headed the American Woman Suffrage Association. The National Woman Suffrage Association limited voting membership to women only, favored a national approach through a federal amendment, and supported a basket of other causes through their newspaper, The Revolution. The American Woman Suffrage Association, open to both men and women, focused specifically on the ballot and worked to gain suffrage on a state-by-state basis. They were encouraged by the example of Wyoming Territory, which wrote equal suffrage into its constitution in 1869, and kept it when Wyoming became a state in 1890. In Minnesota, the first formal clubs developed after the war. The Minneapolis Suffrage Club was formed in 1868. In 1869, Sarah Berger Stearns founded a suffrage club in Rochester, Minnesota, and the same year, Mary Jackman Colburn began another in Champlin. Stearns had been born in New York City in 1836, but her family moved to Ohio, where she attended a women's rights convention in Cleveland in 1850, and to Michigan, where she applied for admission to the University of Michigan and was turned down because the university did not admit ladies. Instead, she attended normal school and taught at a girls' school. After the Civil War, she and her husband moved to Minnesota. Suffragists repeatedly presented petitions to the Minnesota legislature. The two petitions in 1870 contained 750 signatures in total. The bill that passed both houses that session permitted women as well as men to vote on a constitutional amendment to enfranchise women, but the bill was vetoed by Governor Austin. A few years later, in 1875, the legislature passed a bill to submit to the voters an amendment to the state constitution allowing women to vote in school board elections in recognition of the traditional female sphere of children and teaching. The suffragists of Minnesota adopted a curious tactic. According to Stearns, they did nothing to promote the amendment before the election, hoping their opponents, which they assumed was the liquor industry, would not stir up opposition to it. Instead, they used their indirect influence to persuade friends in both parties to print only a yes box next to the amendment. Parties printed their own ballots at that time. Thus, 24,340 of the faithful in both parties checked yes, and only 19,469 men bothered to, as William Watts Falwell phrased it, unbutton their coats, get out their glasses, fumble for a pencil, and cross out yes and write no. The next year, women won school board elections: Charlotte Wisconsin Van Cleve and Charlotte Winchell in Minneapolis, and Mary Jane Colburn in Champlin. An attempt to pass a similar amendment giving women the right to vote on temperance issues failed to pass the legislature in 1877 and again in 1881. The liquor interests saw women's suffrage as a threat, in part because the Women's Christian Temperance Union, under the presidency of Frances Willard, officially endorsed the women's suffrage cause in 1879. In Minnesota, Julia Bullard Nelson was the vice president of the state WCTU for one term, and in 1881 she was among 14 women that met in Hastings to form the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association as an affiliate of the National. Sarah Berger Stearns, now living in Duluth and already a vice president of the National Association, was elected president. The Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association seemingly worked with the National and American Women's Suffrage Associations impartially. Perhaps their philosophical differences seemed trivial to the local suffragists. Stearns' successor, Dr. Martha Ripley, was president from 1883 to 1889. She had been educated in Massachusetts and knew both Stone and Blackwell. Probably due to her influence, Minneapolis hosted the American Women's Suffrage Association's annual meeting in 1885. Yet, during Ripley's tenure, Stearns continued to associate herself with the Minnesota Association and was a speaker at the 1884 state annual meeting. Moreover, the Minnesota suffragists sent a petition to Congress urging passage of the federal amendment. Dr. Ripley was the founder of the maternity hospital, specializing in giving quality obstetrical care to poor mothers, especially unmarried women. A surprising number of Minnesota suffragists were doctors. Besides Ripley, there was Margaret Cook and Cora Smith Eaton. The mother-daughter team of doctors, Ethel and Anna Hurd, allowed their professional office to double as headquarters for the state association before the organization had an office of its own. In 1898, another referendum added library board to the voting rights of women. However, in that same election, another amendment was ratified, changing the rules about how the Constitution could be amended. Previously, an amendment had to gain a majority of the votes cast on that amendment. Now the amendment had to have a majority of all votes cast in the election. In other words, not voting on the amendment was an automatic no vote. An issue as controversial as women's suffrage could not hope to pass that hurdle. By the end of the 19th century, women were making gains in non-political fields. Many colleges in Minnesota were coeducational, including the University of Minnesota and private colleges like Macalester and Hamlin in St. Paul. Women were still paid less than men and rarely were promoted to upper management, but it was possible for a single woman to earn a living in professions like teaching and nursing, and increasingly as clerical workers in that new high-tech field of typewriting. Bloomers even came back into limited use as exercise gear for all-female gym classes or bicycle riding. By 1890, the first generation of suffragists was fading away, and younger women were taking up leadership positions. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, and Lucy Stone's daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, among others, helped facilitate a merger of the National and American Woman Suffrage Associations. The combined organization focused on suffrage work, avoiding other more controversial aspects of women's rights. By the beginning of the 20th century, the spread of women's suffrage had stalled. Only 4 states in the West, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Colorado, had equal suffrage before 1910. In state after state, referendums to amend their constitutions failed. Bills to pass a federal amendment were tabled. The argument that equal suffrage was only fair had failed to convince. Now suffrage arguments shifted to emphasize the argument from expedience. Suffragists predicted that women, if allowed to vote, would usher in needed reforms. This appealed to populist and progressive reformers and to labor unions. However, the credibility of this argument depended on the old anti-argument of woman's sphere and ideas of true womanhood. Women were purer than men, and they would not tolerate prostitution, vice, and corruption in government. Women were the guardians of the home, and they would insist on regulations to ensure pure water, safe milk, and clean cities. Women were natural mothers, and they would protect children from exploitation in factories and support measures for their health and education. However, as a New York Times editorial opined, the only effective argument was the argument from numbers. So long as legislators could plausibly argue that their constituents didn't favor equal suffrage, they could safely ignore petitions and speeches from others. Younger women grew impatient with the lack of progress. 25-year-old Alice Paul returned from Britain in 1910, where she had learned more militant tactics from the Pankhursts and the Women's Social and Political Union, the so-called suffragettes, sneeringly named by their opponents. She championed the idea of a federal amendment and was given charge of the moribund Congressional Committee of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. In 1913, she organized a parade in Washington, D.C. on the eve of President Wilson's inauguration. 5,000 women from around the country marched up Pennsylvania Avenue in spite of hecklers and even physical violence. She, along with Lucy Burns and Crystal Eastman, revived lobbying for the Anthony Amendment and formed the National Woman's Party. After ratification, and until her death in 1977, Alice Paul worked for the Equal Rights Amendment. In 1916, Carrie Chapman Catt, the new president of the national organization, introduced her Winning Plan, a multi-pronged strategy for winning the vote. The states that already had suffrage were to put pressure on their representatives to introduce the federal amendment. States like Minnesota, whose constitutions were nearly impossible to amend, were to lobby for presidential suffrage, which only required the majority vote of the state legislature. Other states, where amendments seemed possible, were to be organized. Organization in this case was modeled on the system used by political parties. Every precinct was to have a club or committee that reported to the ward or district, and so on up to the state and national associations. In theory, this meant that whenever a bill was before the legislature, the headquarters staff could alert local suffragists to inundate their representative with letters and telegrams from his own district, thus refuting the contention of the antis that most women didn't want the vote. Where full-fledged clubs could not be found, a committee of a dozen or even half a dozen would do. Women who had other demands on their time, home and child care, careers, clubs, and other reforms, found it hard to devote themselves fully to suffrage work as leaders such as Susan B. Anthony did. With coordination from headquarters, even small efforts could produce impressive results. A farm wife with young children, or a woman working 60 hours a week in a factory, might be willing to write to her legislator or sign a petition. A woman who had more free time might be able to circulate that petition at her club or church, or host fundraising events. Who were the suffrages? Ida Lusk Holman, in an interview shortly after her 100th birthday, reflected that unless you were a very conservative person, you just naturally took up suffrage. Historians looking for socio-economic motivations characterize suffragists as middle-class wasps. That was true of a majority of the leadership in Minnesota, but only women with sufficient leisure income and probably domestic help were in a position to devote time and money to the cause, regardless of their sympathies. Even so, Minnesota also had a working women's suffrage club, a socialist suffrage club, and some of the leading suffragists were exceptions to this stereotype. Nellie Griswold Francis, born in Tennessee, graduated from Central High School in St. Paul. Although offered a college scholarship, she chose to take a stenography class and worked as a stenographer before her marriage. She was a member of the Women's Welfare League in St. Paul, the National Association of Colored People, president of the Minnesota State Federation of Colored Women, and founder of the Every Woman Suffrage Club. Ulen called her a star. She successfully lobbied for anti-lynching legislation in Minnesota in 1921. Myrtle Cain, from an Irish Catholic family, became a labor activist and a member of the National Woman's Party. She was elected to the Minnesota legislature in 1922 and worked for the Equal Rights Amendment until her death in 1980. But were the anti-suffragist women any different? They were also white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, although the most prominent were upper class economically. For example, Caroline McKnight Christian, vice president of the Minnesota Association opposed to the further extension of suffrage to women, was the daughter and wife of millionaires. Unlike so many of the suffragists, she had never needed to work for a living. One prominent Minnesota suffrage leader was Linden Hills resident Clara Ulen. She was born Clara Hampson in Akron, Ohio on October 10, 1860. Her father joined the Union Army at the beginning of the Civil War, but was discharged in 1863. He may have been affected by wounds or disease because he remained in poor health and died when Clara was only 8 years old. His widow and 2 children moved in 1869 to Faribault, Minnesota, where they lived for a time with Clara's aunt. A few years later, the 3 of them moved to Minneapolis, where they lived above Smith & Day's hardware store on Washington Avenue. In 1879, they moved to this apartment building on 818 10th Street. Clara's mother may have eked out her small pension with sewing, but city directories don't state an occupation for her. After high school, Clara's brother worked as a lithographer from 1876 to 1879, and Clara taught school from 1880 to 1885. Clara and her brother Fred attended Washington School. Her classmates recall that her personality made her popular. She turned down offers from 3 other boys in order to attend the junior ball with the only African-American boy in her class. She did well in school, but family finances made it impossible for her to afford college. However, she continued to learn and attended lectures and study clubs. It was at one such literary meeting that Andreas Ulen first met her in 1875 when she was just 15. Andreas Ulen had emigrated from Norway to Minnesota in 1871 and worked as a farm laborer for a time. He taught himself English and moved to Minneapolis. Studying law at night and working as a laborer on the Minneapolis sewer system by day, he passed the bar exam in 1877. Andreas developed a reputation as a lawyer among the Scandinavian immigrant community. He argued the case of Moose versus Moose, in which a wife sued her husband for control of the inheritance from her Norwegian father. Although the couple had been in America for 20 years, the husband argued that Norwegian laws applied, which gave him the right to his wife's property. Andreas argued that Minnesota law applied, which by that time allowed married women to own property. His argument prevailed, and the wife won her case. In 1881, he was appointed a judge in probate court. Now securely established in his career, he married Clara Hampson in 1885. Over the next 20 years, they built a house on land that was 4 miles from downtown Minneapolis and raised 7 of the 8 children that Clara bore. Also during these years, Clara kept up her intellectual interests through participation in the Unitarian Church and the Peripatetics, a literary club. As a former teacher, she believed strongly in the intellectual development of children. Clara Euland, Alice Ames Winter, and Josephine Searles Simpson formed the Minneapolis Kindergarten Association in 1892, which organized several free kindergartens and sponsored a training school for kindergarten teachers. They hired Stella Louise Wood to take over the training course and lobbied for kindergarten to be added to the public school offerings. By 1905, Minneapolis had free half-day kindergarten in public schools. This experience honed her skills for organizing and lobbying. Clara Euland came late to suffrage work, although she was friends with Maud Conkey Stockwell, president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association from 1900 to 1910. They had both attended Washington School, although Maud was 3 years younger, and in 1883 both taught at Jefferson School. In 1907, Clara was one of the founding members of the Women's Club in Minneapolis and served on the board until 1912. Her friend Alice Ames Winter was elected its first president. During that time, the club campaigned for clean streets, clean water, and protections for women working in retail establishments. The club shied away from endorsing women's suffrage for fear of offending some of the more conservative members, including Carolyn Christian. The example of Elsa, Clara's second daughter, may have contributed to her mother's decision to become more active in suffrage work. While a student at the University of Minnesota, Elsa joined the College Equal Suffrage Club and served as its first president. After graduation, she worked in a New York settlement house and joined the Congressional Union. In 1912, the Eulands hosted the first of their fundraising suffrage garden parties on their lawn. The following year, she invited 40 Minnesota women to meet in her home to organize the Equal Suffrage Association of Minneapolis. She set annual dues at $5 at a time when most suffrage clubs asked only $1 or less. She insisted funds were necessary to work effectively. She was asked to chair the committee for the Suffrage Parade planned for May 2, 1914. It was to be one of 1,000 parades planned around the country on that date. Suffrage parades were fairly new then, the first in New York City in 1910, and the larger 1913 parade in Washington had attracted much publicity. The Minneapolis parade was a great success. An estimated 2,000 women, men, and children marched or rode on horses or in cars. Euland marched with the Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association contingent. A mass meeting at the Municipal Auditorium followed with Ole Sagang, a state senator, and Maria Sanford, first woman professor at the University of Minnesota, addressing the crowd. The newspaper coverage the next day was enthusiastic, if a little condescending. Minneapolis learned by practical demonstration that those who ask the ballot for women are distinctly not a bevy of hopeless spinsters, unhappily married women, and persons who have nothing else to do. On October 7, 1914, Clara Euland was elected president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. One of her first acts was to hire an experienced suffrage organizer. Maria McMahon began working in the southern counties of Minnesota early in 1915. A year later, in January 1916, Renee Stevens began her organizing work in Stillwater for a salary of $75 a month plus expenses. Euland's Dear Suffragist newsletter explained that the cost was paid for by the kindness of some of our men friends. The Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association raised $2,000 to build the Women's Citizen Building on the fairgrounds in time for the 1917 State Fair. Besides direct donations from members and friends, they held bake sales and hosted a Scandinavian culture night at St. Paul's Central High School that drew an audience of 1,000 paying customers. At the Women's Citizen Building, various suffrage clubs took turns distributing pamphlets and cups of cold water to passing fairgoers. Imaginative use of new technology attracted attention and dramatized the cause. At a time when automobiles were rare, an autocade brought the curious crowding around to look and listen to suffrage speakers. Pageants and plays served as fundraising as well as consciousness-raising events. The National Association produced a silent film in 1914 entitled Your Girl and Mine that played in commercial theaters. It may have been good publicity, though not a moneymaker. During Euland's presidency, the State Association established an office in the Essex Building at 10th and Nicollet and had a series of paid secretaries as well as several part-time and volunteer workers who typed letters, mimeographed lists, and kept records which are now in the Minnesota Historical Society. The 1917 annual report said that the office staff handled 14,000 letters in the previous 12 months. Yulin's signature appears on countless letters over the 5 years of her service, encouraging organizers in the field, asking for money, asking for letters to legislators when suffrage bills were up for a vote, and asking for telegrams to Governor Burnquist to call a special session to ratify the Anthony Amendment. As her friend and fellow suffragist Maud Stockwell said, "Too much credit for the final success of women's suffrage in Minnesota cannot be given to Mrs. Yulind. She organized the entire state, raised large sums of money each year, induced many prominent women to join in the work, and not only took advantage of every opportunity for propaganda, but created opportunities." I have been able to positively identify 3 other women from Linden Hills who were delegates to the State Suffrage Convention in 1917. By that year, all of their children were in their late teens or older. Lillian Chatterton Timberlake, age 45 in 1917, lived at 4312 Linden Hills Boulevard in apartment number 9 in the Dakota Apartments. Her husband Byron was an insurance executive. Jessie Sharpnack Cobb, also 45 years old, lived at 4620 West Lake Harriet Boulevard in 1917. Her husband Frederick was a dentist. Catherine Bingham Van Tool, age 58, lived at 4236 Queen Avenue. Her husband Charles worked for the State Mutual Life Insurance Company. Nanny Matson Yeager, daughter of Swedish immigrants, was a president of the Scandinavian Women's Suffrage Association from 1913 until it disbanded in 1920. She lived on James Avenue North until 1924, when she and her husband Luth moved to 4236 Linden Hills Boulevard, which has since been demolished. The U.S. entry into World War I posed a dilemma for suffragists. During the Civil War, agitation for women's rights had ceased in favor of war work. Should women continue with the suffrage cause or help in the national war effort? The Congressional Union under Alice Paul said no to war work and redoubled their efforts, picketing the White House, using Wilson's own words against him. As a result, they were labeled disloyal and jailed repeatedly. Up to this point, the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association had coexisted with the more militant suffragists. Bertha Mahler was a paid organizer for the State Association in northern Minnesota in 1917, but she left the next year to join the suffragette pickets in 1918. The public perception of disloyal suffragettes, as the picketers were called, not to mention the Public Safety Commission hysteria, forced Yulind to issue statements that the state organization was not affiliated with the picketers. She advised Minnesota suffragists to support the war effort as a suffrage club rather than individually. Clubs held knitting parties to make socks for our boys over there, and shared food conservation advice for meatless Tuesdays and wheatless Wednesdays to help the war effort. The National Suffrage Organization supported 3 field hospitals in France, staffed entirely by women. Suffragists maintained that suffrage work was war work, for how could the country be safe for democracy if half the population could not vote? The final drive for ratification demonstrated the effectiveness of the organizing strategies. In June 1918, Yulind sent a letter to each of the state legislative candidates asking their position on the federal amendment. If their replies were noncommittal, she asked the local organizations in that district to talk with the candidates privately and decide who to support. Additional paid organizers were sent out to recruit committees in each district, where they did not already exist, to support a massive petition drive that would prove the argument from numbers decisively. The goal was to have a majority of voters and an equal number of women sign a petition addressed to the Minnesota legislature asking them to ratify the federal amendment. The petition was to be presented at the January 1919 legislative session after the U.S. Congress had passed the bill for an amendment, as was expected. Now the committees in every part of the state were called on to get these signatures. Each was assigned a quota of signatures to collect in their political subdivision and sent back to headquarters for consolidation into a monster petition. The work was hampered by the first cases of the influenza pandemic that appeared in September 1918. By October, public meetings were banned. Theaters, churches, and schools closed. This made it impossible to seek signatures at club meetings or ladies' aid societies. Door-to-door solicitation was slower, and even that was limited if houses were under quarantine. Suffragists or their families fell ill as well. In Cloquet and northeastern counties, forest fires destroyed 20 towns and killed 600 people, diverting attention of the women of those areas. The state suffrage annual meetings, scheduled in December, had to be canceled due to the ban on public meetings. Since Congress had not yet passed the bill, work on the petition resumed in January and February 1919. Suffragists managed, in spite of everything, to collect 90,000 signatures. Far short of their goal, but it was more than 4 times the number of signers on the monster petition of 1910. The Minnesota legislative session ended before the U.S. Senate passed the Anthony Amendment, but the legislature did pass a law extending voting rights for presidential electors. Although superseded by the 19th Amendment, it demonstrates the growth of suffrage support in Minnesota. The evening after the U.S. Senate approved the federal amendment by the needed 3/4 majority, on June 8, 1919, 250 automobiles decorated in yellow converged on the Capitol from Minneapolis and St. Paul. Because of heavy rain, the speeches moved indoors to the rotunda. The next day, work began on a quiet campaign to have the governor call a special session so that Minnesota could ratify the amendment before the next regular legislative session in 1921. Again, letters went out from headquarters to legislators. Governor Burnquist, assured by other governors that they would also be willing to call special sessions, called the session for September 8, 1919. Minnesota thus became the 15th state to ratify the amendment. Suffragists served a thank-you luncheon in the Capitol cafeteria for the legislators at noon and held a celebratory dinner for suffrage supporters in the St. Paul Hotel that evening. The Tennessee legislature, by 1 vote, ratified on August 18, 1920, and the U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby officially certified the amendment adopted on August 26, 1920. The very next day, an election was scheduled in South St. Paul to vote on a bonding issue. Women there became the first in the nation to vote under the terms of the 19th Amendment on August 27th. Clara Euland was the obvious choice for first president of the League of Women Voters, formed to educate all voters about political issues. She continued her reform work. On March 1, 1927, she spent the day lobbying in St. Paul for the outlawing of child labor. On her way back from the Capitol via streetcar, she was crossing Richfield Road toward home. A truck driving downhill on an icy street was unable to stop. She died at the scene. This memorial plaque was installed at the Capitol building the following year. Was the vote worth all these sacrifices? It is true that women voted in lower numbers than men at first, but the percentages grew equal by the 1960s. Some of the predicted results have happened. Women serve in the military and in the Senate. Women work as lawyers, doctors, ministers, and college professors. Some men have learned to cook dinner and care for children. Polling places are typically schools, churches, and libraries rather than saloons. Violence against women is treated more seriously rather than ignored. Girls' athletics have to be supported on a par with boys. And as of 1975, married women can obtain credit on her own name without her husband's permission. Of course, Prohibition failed to ensure temperance, although alcohol consumption no longer reaches the peaks of the 19th century. Campaign finance laws have loopholes that allow influence peddling, if not outright bribery. The glass ceiling has barely cracked, and while equal pay for equal work receives lip service, it has not yet become a reality. I, for one, am grateful to all those women and men who worked against the odds to change hearts and minds so that Americans can continue to strive for the ideal of government of all the people, by all the people, and for all the people. The ratification of the 19th Amendment was a milestone in democratic reform. So remember these ladies and be sure to vote this year.
Linda, would you like to talk about your thoughts behind choosing this program and doing the research?
Well, I chose it because I was interested in women's history ever since college, and I have done a lot of research on it. I've gone through the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association papers at the Historical Society, and read various secondary sources. So I am interested in women's history generally.
Was it possible for Minneapolis residents to vote in like local elections? Did women have the right to vote before the general ratification?
Only for school board and library board.
Okay.
And after 1919, they would have been able to vote for presidential electors if the 19th Amendment had been passed.
Mhm.
I have a question. Did
Yes.
Clara's daughter, Brenda, continue with her mother's efforts in women's rights?
Not specifically. She had her own career with writing. She was quite a bit younger than Elsa, so she was not actively involved. I did interview Brenda when I was writing my dissertation, and she said that she didn't participate in the cause at the time. She was still in high school, I think, by that time.
Linda, was there anything else you would like to say about the women's temperance movement and its impact on the women's suffrage movement?
Well, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was established because women were not equal members in the men's temperance organizations, and it was Frances Willard that really turned it toward women's suffrage as a means for getting prohibition or temperance um, established. Uh, she was she wasn't primarily interested in suffrage, but it was a means to her ends, and that was one of the few organizations that was well established before the suffrage organization in Minnesota. The WCTU had a newsletter called the White Ribbon, which was published more regularly than any suffrage newsletter before 1900, and they often carried information about suffrage activities. But not all the women that were involved in suffrage. Clara Hewlett was not a member of the WCTU, for example. So there was a lot of overlap, but it wasn't a one-on-one thing.
How about the League of Women Voters? That, Clara, I believe you mentioned, became the first president or director of it.
The Minnesota League of Women Voters, yes. And the League, of course, is still active, and it was set up with the idea that they would be educating voters, not just women, but all voters to the issues, and that's why they used to be the ones that sponsored debates, so they'd be nonpartisan was the intention. And the League of Women Voters in Minnesota effectively started immediately after ratification in Minnesota. They dissolved the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association and became the League of Women Voters.
I thought it was really interesting how you talked about the organizational skills of women in working with the suffrage group and how they learned and became more professional and how that benefited them and the organization push.
I think that was crucial because individually they could make speeches and people might be convinced, but that didn't change anything as far as the law went until they could act as a pressure group and get people who might be sympathetic, but I'm sure everyone realizes how hard it is to get involved in social changes now. If you've got a home, you've got family, you've got work, you've got other things on your plate, so you can't. Susan B. Anthony could devote pretty much 100% of her energy towards women's suffrage, but not everyone could. And those who might have been sympathetic didn't really have a way of, they couldn't go out and get on trains and lecture in 100 towns a year, as some of the suffragists did. And they were able to contribute, even though they couldn't devote their whole life to it, but they could make a contribution because there were people who organized them. And I think having an experience of working for a living made a difference. It seemed like almost all at least at the leadership, had to work for a living, at least for a time in their lives. And people like Carolyn Christian didn't have that experience. And I must have shown them what kind of obstacles women still had. If your path was smooth because you had money and had protection from powerful husbands or fathers, or you had domestic help and you had a lot of privileges, it didn't seem like there was anything that needed to be changed.
Did you have a favorite woman who was working in the movement?
Well, I kind of like Lucy Stone because she kept her name after her marriage, as I did, and so I think of her as a role model.
Hi, Linda. After the 19th Amendment was passed, were there any Minnesota women that you know of that ultimately held elected office in Minnesota and or nationally?
Well, Myrtle Cain, as in the state legislature, actually there were 4 women. I'd have to look up their names. There were 4 women who were elected to the state legislature in 1922, and there have always been 1 or 2. And then there was Cora Knutson in the 50s that was elected to the U.S. Congress. But it hasn't. We haven't had We've got 2 female senators from Minnesota now, which is, I think, a first for Minnesota anyway.
I understood that in New Hampshire, when women got to vote, the whole state flipped, and instead of being a Democratic state, it became a Republican state.
I do not know.
Can you speak to any flipping that went on right after the amendment?
Phil wants to know if there was a change in the composition of the voters, if they were more Republicans or more Democrats. I don't know about other states. There wasn't much of a change in Minnesota. The election in 1920 went to Warren Harding, of course, who was a Republican, and Republicans stayed in office until the Depression, all through the 20s. So, and Minnesota was Republican primarily, except with a few exceptions, before from 1860 to 1920.
Any other questions this evening?
I just have a reminder for everyone. Early voting starts on September 18th.
Yes, and you can go online to get your absentee ballot if you choose to do it that way. Just don't wait till the last minute to send it in, as we don't know how Postal Service is going to be able to handle it all. There's also drop boxes, but you can find that on mnvotes.gov, I believe, is the website.
Well, Linda, thank you for organizing this event to celebrate the 100-year anniversary. And we see that universal voting rights are more important than ever 100 years later. So thank you, everybody, and please join us for the next programs.